Welcome back. This is part 5 of how Bach chorales work, and it's time to look at some standard chord progressions, that is, patterns for which chords go in which order in terms of their roots. There are dozens of such progressions, but most of them belong to one of these few categories which we can cover. You can do these progressions in any key, major or minor. One type of progression is the predominant dominant tonic type of progression, which we'll look at first. And it's a predominant chord followed by a dominant one followed by a tonic one, or possibly just a dominant one followed by a tonic one. Next, we've got passing chords in which the bass moves by step. And most of these chords will be first inversion chords. Then we've got a couple of miscellaneous progressions involving the subdominant or submediant chords. And then we've got sequential progressions, which in most Baroque genres would be used all the time and would be a big proportion of a concerto movement or that kind of thing. But they're not such a feature of chorales, partly because the tunes are not automatically sequential. But we'll look at them briefly. And then after that, we'll look at modulation by pivot chord, and that will be the art of combining examples of these in different keys. Alright then, the first concept is predominant dominant tonic. This is very useful as a notion because it covers lots of different progressions which would otherwise be very difficult to remember. And the quick summary is that the tonic chord in a given key is the end goal and also the normal starting point. The dominant chord, chord 5, makes you expect the tonic, but so does the leading note chord, as we've already noticed, or indeed the leading note diminished seventh chord in a minor key. They all make you expect the tonic. So these can be regarded as dominant functioning chords or dominant substitute chords. And occasionally after the dominant chord you don't get the tonic at all, but a surprise chord, such as chord 6, as in an interrupted cadence, but not just in a cadence. Chord 6 can be called a tonic substitute chord because it's very closely related to the tonic chord. It includes two of the same notes, including the tonic note. But the surprise factor presupposes that you would normally expect the dominant to go to the tonic. And then the predominant chords, of which there are several, make you expect the dominant chord. And you can go round and round. I'm going to come back to the predominant chords. Now, why is the tonic chord perceived as the goal or the target? Let's say it's because your mind gathers that the tonic note is the keynote that defines the scale, and the tonic chord is the most stable consonant chord that includes all three of the most stable degrees that I mentioned earlier. What's maybe less obvious is why the dominant chord should make you expect the tonic chord. What is it about the dominant note that gives it that function? And the historical answer is that it's not originally the dominant note that has this effect, but the other two, primarily, the leading note and the supertonic, because they are a step below and above the tonic. And in medieval and Renaissance music, closure would be primarily a matter of one voice, conventionally the tenor, settling on the tonic by descending a step from the note above. In the modal system, the tonic would be called the final, and another voice would ascend a semitone, also to the tonic, and you get an imperfect consonance of a sixth, resolving in contrary motion and by step to an octave. And if you added another note in the bass underneath these two, that wasn't just doubling one of these notes, it would have to be the dominant note, because it's the only note that is consonant underneath these two. But primarily it was these two notes resolving by step to the tonic that gave you the feeling of closure. Let's say this is the origin of chord 5. And a Renaissance cadence would be like this, except that you'd normally get a suspension as well. A cadential suspension, which was the tonic note resolving down to the leading note. And then the leading note chord has a similar or equivalent effect because it also includes the supertonic note and the leading note, together this time with the subdominant note, which is the note that you would add in between those two notes. And that would resolve up or down in the way that we already discussed. And if you use a dominant seventh chord, then you're using all four of these notes. The supertonic, the leading note, the dominant note, and the subdominant note. And now the subdominant note really has to resolve down because it's a seventh. But the point is that these three chords are roughly equivalent because they share notes. So we can say that the dominant functioning chords will be triads or seventh chords using 3 or 4 of these notes, and sometimes even including this one. Because if we use a leading note seventh chord, we'll use these 4 notes. If we just use a leading note chord, we'll use these 3 notes. If we do a dominant seventh, we'll use these 4 notes. And if we do a dominant triad, we'll use these 3 notes. But in all cases, we'll use the leading note and the supertonic. This is in the key of C major. And then this would be followed by the tonic chord. Or you throw in a surprise. Now you can distinguish between cadential and non-cadential examples of this. Let's look at cadences first. When chords 5 and 1 occur at the end of a phrase, and they're both in root position, you've got a cadence, which for A-level and ABRSM and so on, I think is normally called a perfect cadence. And in academia, it's often called authentic cadence. And music analysts will distinguish between a perfect authentic cadence, in which the soprano voice ends on the tonic note, which will be the most conclusive option, and an imperfect one, in which the soprano voice doesn't end on the tonic degree, but normally the mediant. This is what you'd normally get at the end of a chorale, and this sounds slightly less conclusive than this one. And in this terminology, the words perfect and imperfect refer to the scale degree of the soprano note. And at a cadence or elsewhere, the dominant chord is quite frequently decorated with a 4/3 suspension, or with a second inversion chord, which we covered, aka 1C, but really chord 5 with either a suspension or passing notes resolving to a 5/3 here, resolving to root position chord here. And as I mentioned a few times, the leading note normally resolves up, but there's a special exception to this in cadences, in Bach chorales, or in some of his other pieces as well, which is that sometimes the leading note, when it's in an inner part, skips down instead. And this is because Bach wants to end with a complete tonic chord, root plus third plus fifth, and he doubles the root, 2 roots, 1/3 and 1/5. And more often than not, in a cadence, the soprano will end supertonic, going down to the tonic. And if it's an authentic cadence, the bass note has to be the tonic as well. So that's 2 roots, and therefore the third and the fifth have to go in the inner parts. So this means the leading note can't resolve without giving you an incomplete chord that would have 3 roots. So therefore the leading note will skip instead, and it will normally skip down to the dominant note. Or sometimes, if it's in the tenor, it will skip up to the mediant. And even if it's in the minor key, Bach will do this sometimes, which would give you a diminished 4th leap. But But in a minor chorale, by the way, he'll end with a tierce de Picardy, a Picardy third, which is to say the last tonic chord will be a major chord. And there's even another quirk in chorales, which is that when a soprano phrase ends with the mediant and tonic notes, sometimes Bach will harmonise these with a subdominant cadence, like this. So if my chorale is in C major, and a phrase ends E, C, sometimes Bach will harmonise it like a cadence in F, throwing in a seventh, for example, to make it really sound like a cadence in F, even though the leading note skips down. I've been discussing cadences, but the progression 5-1 or 5-7-1 is used all the time, not just in cadences. Typically, composers will avoid making both dominant and tonic chords root position all the time. First inversion chords will often be used before the cadence. For example, let's say the tune goes E, C, B, D, C, etc. You might go chord 1, 1, first inversion, 5, 5, first inversion, 1. And that would give you the intervals compound third, sixth, third, third, and then an octave. And in this example, the E is on the way up to the G, and the B is on the way up to the C. And in fact, we could also fill in a complete scale with passing notes. And then we would add inner parts. Depending on what happened before, we might go like this. And then if we just go D, we'll have parallel fifths because of the passing note. So we could either omit the passing note or perhaps skip up to the third in the tenor, which would give you quite a nice dissonance on the way up. The predominant function. Pre means before, and sure enough, these chords come before the dominant, and therefore they create some expectation of the dominant. There are several of them. The most common one is the supertonic chord, especially in first inversion. And the inner parts would be something like this. You often double the third in a supertonic chord. And this has the effect of ready and tonic, or bish, bash, bosh. Or the supertonic chord can be a seventh chord, in which case the tonic is the seventh, which resolves by step to the leading note. And this seventh will be prepared normally like a suspension, or sometimes like a descending passing note, which corresponds to our Renaissance cadence. So this would have to be a consonant chord, and most often it's going to be a tonic chord, perhaps in first inversion. And this is another occasion in which we don't want parallel fifths, so we might double the third, depending on what happens before. And if we use chord 6 instead of chord 1 as a substitute, we get a small surprise. Not that big a surprise because it happens so often. But we could say that the effect, psychologically, the effect is ready and surprise. Predominant, dominant, tonic, or chord 6 as a surprise substitute. And quite often you get more than one of these in a row. It goes round and round. 2 or more. For example, here are bars 3 to 5 of Chorale number 151 in Riemenschneider, and the harmony is like this. chords are 1 G major, 1 first inversion, passing note, chord 5 with a 4-3 suspension, chord 1 again. And then in this bar, we've got the notes G, E, A, C. That's an A minor 7th chord in 3rd inversion. So it's 2, 4, 2, followed by dominant 7th chord in 1st inversion, and then back to 1. So it's predominant, dominant, tonic, but this is not cadential because the dominant chord is not root position, and it's not at the end of a phrase. Then change of position to 1st inversion, and then it's chord 2 again, 2, 7. Again, there's the suspension. This A is also a suspension. 9/8 suspension. And then 5, 1 with a 7th in between. 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1. This is extremely common. The supertonic chord is the most common predominant, but not the only one. You could also use the subdominant chord, followed by the dominant, and then tonic, either root position or 1st inversion chord. And then your inner parts might be like this. Or maybe the subdominant 1st inversion, something like this. Or even, in some cases, the subdominant 7th chord, provided that the 7th is prepared like a suspension. Or you could use the submediant chord as a predominant. This would typically happen when the tune goes up 1, 2, 3, tonic, supertonic, mediant. Or a predominant chord could be what we call an applied dominant chord or a secondary dominant. Namely, the dominant, normally the dominant 7th of the dominant. So if I'm in C major, here's my dominant chord, G major chord. And the idea here is that I momentarily pretend that I'm in G major, and I throw in what would be the dominant or dominant 7th, which would be D7. For example, here is a dominant 7th in 1st inversion of 5, and this F sharp is treated like the leading note in G major. And this note C is the 7th of a 7th chord, so it resolves down like this. And after this, I just stop pretending to be in the key of G, and I just resume in the key of C major and do a tonic chord. And this 7th would be prepared in the normal way. And if I want to be really fancy, then I could use, instead of the dominant of the dominant, I could use the leading note chord of the dominant, and even the leading note 7 of the dominant. Here's the same dominant, G. And if I were in G major, the leading note would be F sharp, not F, but F sharp. And if I did a diminished 7th chord on the note F sharp as a root, the notes would be F sharp, A, C, and E flat. So it's almost the same as a dominant 7th chord. And this E flat is the 7th now, and it resolves down by step. And the C at the top is now the 5th, but it's a diminished 5th, so it resolves down by step as I previously described. So this could happen. And then after that, I could again stop pretending to be in G and go back into C. E flat isn't really in G major at all, so this would be an example of what we call mode mixture or modal mixture. And if we analyze how all these predominant chords are related, we'll see that they're again related in a network of thirds like this. If I'm in C major, then my predominant chords are the supertonic chord, the supertonic 7th chord, the subdominant chord, possibly the subdominant 7th chord, if I treat the E as a suspension, or the submedian chord. And if I use an applied chord, then the F would be sharp, and that would give me the dominant of the dominant 7th normally of the dominant, or possibly the leading note of the dominant, which would be the notes F sharp, A, C, and E flat. Or I could do the half diminished chord. I could just leave E natural. That would still be a predominant. So this is the same story as with the dominant functioning chords, which were either dominant or leading note. Now you can also use more than one predominant at a time, and you would normally do so in this order. There's your tonic. You might use the submediant, and then the subdominant, and then the supertonic 7th perhaps, and then either the dominant of the dominant or the leading note of the dominant, and then the dominant. So that would be what we call a descending third progression from 1 to 6, another descending third to chord 4, another to chord 2, and then the applied chord, and then from 2 to 5 is a descending fifths progression, and from 5 back to 1 is also a descending fifths progression. If I do C major and then A minor, then A is the note that was not in C major. And then if I go F, then F is the note that was not in A minor, etc. And D minor, D is the note that was not in F. And then G is the note, one of the notes that was not in D minor. The applied chord would always be what goes immediately before the dominant, because the applied chord has to resolve immediately to the dominant. Otherwise it doesn't make sense. It just sounds like a wrong chord. And maybe you could even throw in a chord 3 before 6, because from 3 to 6 is another descending fifth progression. And you don't have to use all of these predominant chords. You can also skip any of these ones to fit the tune. For example, you could do 1 to 6 and then straight to 5. Or you could skip 6 and go 1, 4, and then 2, and then 5. Or you could go 1 and 4, skip 2, and do the applied chord. But it's a very useful cycle to know about. Let's say you did use a bunch of these predominant chords, just to illustrate. It might sound something like this. This is C major, A minor, F, D minor first inversion, D7, G, C. Just changed my mind and threw in a leading note, diminished 7th of 5 instead of the dominant 7th. Or you could do a suspension instead. Or you could do a 6-4-5-3 instead. Yet another more or less equivalent progression is to use the leading note chord instead of 5. And before this chord, you would normally use either the subdominant or the supertonic. Chord 4 might give you this passing note. This is entirely conjunct, and it still, roughly speaking, has the effect of ready and tonic. Or sometimes you go from the supertonic to the leading note chord, which if you're in C major would be D minor and then B diminished. This is quite often in quavers, and in fact only one note has to change between chord 2 and chord 7. So you might actually just annotate this as a supertonic chord and then a tonic chord with a passing note. But that would be wrong really, because the supertonic chord doesn't really just progress to the tonic chord like this normally. This note is an essential note. because it turns the supertonic chord into a leading note chord, and therefore a predominant dominant tonic. So watch out for that. Anyway, a lot of Baroque music will consist of cycles of this, going round and round, not using all of the chords, but just a different option each time depending on the tune, most often 2. Then you modulate, and then you do the same thing in the new key, modulate again, do the same thing in the new key, and so on. And the result doesn't get boring because there are so many different equivalent progressions that are all predominant, dominant, tonic. And you can also vary what happens on the strong beat. Now that we've looked at predominance, the other cadences ought to make a little bit more sense. First, we've got the half cadence, aka imperfect cadence. And this is the cadence in which the phrase ends on chord 5 in root position, with a doubled root. Or sometimes with a 6/4 resolving to a 5/3. So what would happen before this chord? Well, it could be the tonic chord, or it could be one of the predominants, such as chord 2, first inversion. And you see this is the exact same voice leading I used earlier when I went on to do a tonic chord for an authentic cadence. Or it could be the subdominant chord, normally again with contrary motion between the outer parts. So if I made this note at the top into a tonic note, it would be a chord 4 instead. Or it could be the submediant chord. In other words, I could do this and then stop on the dominant chord, and so on. And there's an especially nice one, which is interesting to know about, which is called the converging cadence, which uses 2 different predominants, so that the bass line goes like this, with a subdominant note, a raised subdominant, to the dominant note. And it would be something like this. To 5 of 5 in first inversion, and then 5. It's called converging because the outer parts converge in contrary motion. The interrupted or deceptive cadence consists of root position 5 followed by a chord other than the expected tonic chord, but normally one that includes the tonic note. So as I already mentioned, the most normal one goes like this. Instead of the tonic chord, you throw in the surprise submediant chord. But it could also be the subdominant chord in first inversion, maybe even with a suspension in the alto here. Or it could be a couple of applied chords, but let's not jump the gun too much. Now we've covered the concept of predominant, dominant, tonic. And to recap, we go predominant, which could be one of numerous chords, then dominant or leading note chord, and then tonic or surprise chord. And we can then cycle around like this more than once. And you should have a look through some chorales and spot the predominant, dominant, tonic pattern. Our next very useful concept is that of the passing chord. Once again, there are several of these chords, but fortunately there is a very convenient way of remembering the main ones, which is the Baroque formula known as the rule of the octave. This is a formula for harmonizing bass scales or segments of bass scales, not just the whole scale. And it's not really a rule because it's not something that you have to do. It's just called the rule of the octave. Here is an ascending C major scale in the bass line, and here is descending C major scale. And if we were to figure these bass notes as in figured bass, it would look like this. At least this is the simplest version. And this is a pattern that you would use if you had to realize an unfigured bass and deduce what appropriate harmony would be. Now the gaps where there's no figure mean that the chord is a 5-3 or root position chord. So the first thing to notice is that the root position chords only occur on the tonic and dominant notes. So we get chords 1, 5, 1. And these are the main pillars of the harmony. Hence these rectangles which represent pillars of harmony. The sixes are short for 6-3, which means first inversion. So the second thing to notice is that all the other chords on the way up are first inversion chords. This means that the supertonic note is the third of a leading note chord, first inversion. The mediant note, E in this case, is the third of another tonic chord, this time in first inversion. The F is the third of a supertonic chord in first inversion, which corresponds to our predominant chord. Then we get the dominant chord. The submediant note is the third of a subdominant chord in first inversion, and the leading note is the third of a dominant chord in first inversion. And these also correspond to predominant, dominant, and tonic chords. The 5 notes from 1 up to 5 are sometimes called the pentachord because it's 5 notes, and the 4 notes from 5 up to 1 can be called a tetrachord. And the basic idea here is that the in-between chords are passing chords connecting more important chords. So this leading note chord is a passing chord connecting tonic to first inversion tonic, and it's a passing chord in the sense also that the bass note is connecting up these two notes by step, like a passing note. The supertonic chord, as well as being a predominant, is also acting like a passing chord from this tonic chord first inversion to the dominant chord, and then these two chords can act as passing chords to get back up to the tonic. And you can also regard all 3 of these chords as passing chords on the way from the tonic up to the dominant. There are a number of variants, and I won't go through all of them, but very often this chord would be a 7th chord, in other words 2-7-B, and very often this chord, the dominant chord, would be a dominant 7th chord first inversion, or 5-7-B. In a chorale, in fact, it's pretty unlikely that you would use the whole formula all the way up. So I'm in fact just showing you the formula to help you to remember what the most common passing chords are. But let's say that by a sheer fluke you had a melody line that went like this. Then you'd be able to use the rule of the octave formula. Like this, for example. Because your chords are tonic chord, root position, a leading note chord, first inversion, with only one leading note, tonic chord, first inversion, a supertonic 7th chord in first inversion, here's the 7th, and it resolves down, a dominant chord, a subdominant chord in first inversion, dominant chord, first inversion, and a tonic chord. And this would also work if you had an F at the top. It would be a dominant 7th chord in that case. So just to give you an idea, this might come up, but it would require a particular melody. More often, you would use chunks of harmony that correspond to the pentachord, or to only from 1 to 1-6, or from 1-6 to 5, or from 5 up to 1, or even from 4-6 up to 1. You can also decorate the passing 6 chords with 7-6 suspensions, and sometimes the root position chords with 4-3 suspensions. For example, this chord could be decorated with a 7-6 suspension. The formula is almost the same on the way down, but there are 2 quirks. First quirk is that a 6 with a slash through it means that the 6th above the bass would be sharp or raised. And so in fact this chord is an applied chord. It's the leading note of the dominant. In the key of C major, the dominant is G, so the leading note chord of G is F sharp diminished. And the other quirk is that the subdominant note on the way down is normally the seventh of a dominant seventh in third inversion, aka 5/7D. So this is in fact the seventh, S for seventh, and it resolves down. In fact, it's basically a passing note. And then you get the same chords in reverse that we used on the way up. This time the leading note chord is a passing chord going down in the bass. And the pillars of harmony are the same: tonic, dominant, tonic. Tonic, passing chord, dominant, passing chord, passing chord, passing chord, tonic. The rule of the octave is the same in minor keys. You just have to remember to raise the leading note whenever it moves up, and the submediant note whenever it moves up to the leading note. And you wouldn't normally do this sharp note in a minor key. That would give you what's called an augmented sixth chord. So for example, this would all be the same voice leading. And I would just make the leading note raised, otherwise it's not really a leading note. And the same here. And I would make this A raised because it's going up to the leading note. But I would leave this A flat because it's going back down to the dominant note. And there are no B flats in this example because I'm not going down the melodic minor scale. I should emphasize that you're never obliged to use the rule of the octave pattern. It's just very convenient. And there are various other things that could happen, even if you go up or down a scale. For example, you could go up to the subdominant note and do a subdominant chord root position instead. Or you could go up the scale like this, up to the dominant, and then just do a cadence, which would be predominant, dominant, tonic root position. Or you could go up the scale to the note A, but make A a chord 6 in root position, as in an interrupted cadence. That brings me to the miscellaneous progressions involving chord 4 and chord 6. First, there's the plagal progression 4/1, which at the end of a phrase is sometimes called a plagal cadence. Some dispute as to whether that's really a cadence, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. You can end a phrase that way. And chord 4 is a primary chord. It's the third primary chord along with 1 and 5. So this means that you can go from 1 to 4 and back very freely. Just as you can go from 1 to 5 back to 1 very freely. In other words, chord 4 isn't just a predominant, it's also used without a dominant afterwards, just going back to chord 1. And you can also use the passing chords that we just went through to connect 1 up to 4 or back down to 1. And another special progression that Bach often uses is this one. Here, the subdominant chord is used as a dividing or subdividing chord to divide up a leap from the tonic to the mediant note, and just to embellish tonic harmony. So tonic chord, root position, tonic chord, first inversion. In between, you throw in this in-between chord, the subdominant. And this would typically have voice leading like so. And normally contrary motion at the top. And this is another situation in which you have to double the third, otherwise you end up getting parallels or worse voice leading. And here I've doubled the fifth of the tonic chord. And I sometimes call this the Mission Impossible progression, because the bass line sounds like Mission Impossible. Da da dum. As an alternative, with the same bass line, sometimes Bach will use a root position submediant chord like this. This is slightly curious because normally chord 6 doesn't go straight to chord 1. So this is a special idiom. But it's only one note different from this formula. And sometimes Bach will do this in reverse and go from this chord through this one to this one. One other bonus miscellaneous progression for you is 3-4, where the chord 3 is supporting, as we call it, the leading note in the tune. So most often this happens. The soprano tune descends from the tonic by step to the submediant, and then does something else, anything that can come after the subdominant chord, and you harmonize the tonic most often with 1 or occasionally 6, and throw in a passing note perhaps, so that the bass is going in contrary motion here, and on the way you get a chord 3, which is, if you like, the byproduct of the fact that the tune descends by step. Maybe we'll throw in a suspension. The technique of sequence consists of taking a small chunk of music, which is called the model, or in some cases a longer chunk, and then repeating it transposed up or down at least once, and if more than once, by the same number of degrees each time. So this is a descending sequence. And the model could be melody only, or you could have a harmonic sequence in which the model consists of all 4 parts, or however many parts there are. And they'll also descend if it's a descending sequence at the top, or ascend if it's an ascending sequence. Now in a chorale, this technique is only going to be possible if the tune you're harmonizing is already sequential and looks like this, for example. Harmonic sequences are classified in terms of the patterns from one root to the next, and often also in terms of the intervals from top to bottom. And in this example, the chords that I've used are C major in first inversion, then F major, then B diminished in first inversion. And if I don't want to double the leading note, I can do this instead in the tenor, but in a sequence it doesn't matter as much because it's not dominant functioning anyway. Then this is E minor, and then this is A minor first inversion, and this is D minor. And since I'm in C major, the first chord is chord 1. I don't worry too much about the middle chords, but the last chord is chord 2, which I would then use in a normal way, probably as a predominant. So I'd probably go to chord 5 next, which is what I would do anyway if I continued the sequence. And the relationship between roots in this case is that they all descend by a fifth to the next one. From C down a fifth you get F, F down a fifth you get B, diatonic fifth, which in this case is a diminished fifth. Down a fifth is E, down a fifth is A, down a fifth is D, and you don't literally go down a fifth each time in the bass because you'd run out of notes and it would sound absurd. So instead you normally do a zigzag, and I've alternated here between first inversion chords and root position chords, but you could make them all root position chords. And this is called a descending fifths sequence. You can find a little chunk of this sequence in Chorale 211, which is also in C major. And the second phrase goes like this. The bass line goes like so. And the inner parts 5-1, 5-1 again, but first inversion on the beat, and then little consonant skip down to the root there, which is just decorating the metrically accented note. And we've got F, and so on. But this is also the model. And here is a sequence. And here is another sequence, which is then broken off, as is quite normal. So we've got a sequence going around, leading note chord, median chord to chord 6. And Bach has tweaked the sequence just in the inner part to avoid doubling the leading note, as here. And then what happens is that the A minor chord is reinterpreted as chord 1 in A minor, and there's a half cadence in A minor. So Bach uses the sequence to modulate, which is our next topic. Just to give you a few other possible sequence patterns, you've got the ascending fifths sequence, which is much less common than descending fifths one, and only works if the fifths are all perfect. You've got descending fourth, ascending second, so alternating between two different root motions, as in Pachelbel's canon. This unison is approached in contrary motion. And the descending third, ascending fourth pattern. Down a third, up a fourth, down a third, up a fourth, which might go like this. And if you do every other chord in first inversion, you can get this result. And you could even do a chromatic version in which the bass line goes up chromatically and sometimes other notes get altered to fit the bass. Let's make a summary of those progressions in the form of a diagram. The most important chords are tonic and dominant. So if I'm in C major, this is C, G, and C. And very often dominant seventh. So that would be G7. And you'll constantly go back and forth between tonic and dominant. And most of the cadences involve these chords. So 5-1, both in root position. At the end of a phrase is the authentic, aka perfect cadence. Chord 5 root position, you just stop, is the half cadence, also known as the imperfect cadence. And dominant followed by not tonic, usually 6, would be the interrupted, also known as deceptive cadence. And some dispute about this, but let's say 4-1 is a plagal cadence, or at least a plagal progression that sounds a bit like a cadence. Next, we can use predominance on the way to the dominant. The most common is 2, usually in first inversion, so that would be D minor, or D minor 7, which can also often be in root position. Before that, you might get a subdominant chord, and before that, you might get a submediant chord, A minor. So they would be in this order, but these are all optional. And the last one before the dominant would be the dominant of the dominant. So I'm going to put D of 5 here, which is also optional. D of 5 equals the dominant or dominant seventh of the dominant. So if my dominant chord is G, then the dominant seventh of the dominant is D7, D, F sharp, A, C, or the leading note chord in first inversion of the dominant. The chord that would be the leading note chord in G major. which is F sharp diminished in first inversion, or sometimes the leading note 7 in G major, which would be an F sharp diminished 7th chord, or maybe half diminished. So these are predominants, and after the dominant you would again go back to 1, which is the same as starting again, or sometimes you might skip back to 6 or to first inversion of 4 as per the rule of the octave, or occasionally to 2, although 2 normally goes before 5. What else? You can throw in a 3 sometimes before 6. So you can use 1 or 2 of these chords on the way to the dominant, and this is in any key. What else can you do? You can do the rule of the octave, which is to go tonic, through some passing chords, which are all inversions to the dominant, and then through more passing chords to the tonic. And you can do this ascending and descending. And you can just go up to the dominant and stop, or you can go from the dominant to the tonic using passing chords. Mostly first inversion chords with 1 third inversion chord if you go down from the dominant to the tonic. Then we've got the progression 1 to 4 and back again. And I mentioned that you can throw in a 3 before 4 in the context of a leading note in the tune that goes down. And the other progression that I really like has a bass line that resembles the tune of Mission Impossible, but the harmony is tonic, tonic first inversion, and in between a dividing chord, which is either sub-dominant first inversion or the sub-mediant chord. And you can do this normally in this direction, but also backwards. And then on top of these progressions, you can sometimes use a bit of sequence if the tune that you're harmonizing is sequential. At this point, we know enough progressions to harmonize a chorale tune, except I have to explain modulation, which will come next. But I want to go back to our A major chorale from earlier, Du Friedensfürst, Herr Jesu Christ, which you'll be missing by now. We've got our soprano and bass counterpoint, which sounds like this. And I can now reveal the inner parts. We've got E and A completing an A major chord in root position with a doubled root, root 5th, root 3rd. Here we've got D and F sharp, which gives us a D major chord, root position, with the root doubled in unison, and the unison is approached in contrary motion. Passing note. Here we've got D and G sharp, giving us the leading note chord in first inversion with a double 3rd B, and this octave B is also approached in contrary motion. E and A giving us the same tonic chord as before in root position. Then we've got E and B giving us an E major chord in first inversion, chord 5. Then we've got F sharp and A giving us a D major chord, subdominant, first inversion, with a double 3rd, another example of the necessity of doubling the 3rd. Then we've got an E and a B, which gives us a complete dominant 7th chord in first inversion, 3rd, root, 5th, 7th. The 7th resolves down by step, and there's no octave. There's a 5th from E to B, but there's no parallel 5th because we doubled the 3rd in the previous chord. And then we've got another E and an A, giving us the same tonic chord again. And then the inner parts just repeat. So this is still chord 1, but in first inversion. Here we've got F sharp and D, and so we've got the same voicing as here. passing note, back to E and A, which is chord 1 again. And here we have F sharp and A, which gives us supertonic 7th chord, first inversion, or 2-7-B. Here's the 7th. 7th is prepared, as was this one. And it's going to resolve down by step here. And the tenor moves down to an E here. So this is our dominant chord, doubled root, octave, approached in contrary motion, tenor E, alto up to A. Tonic chord, doubled root. And you can see that the tenor line is entirely conjunct and a bit dull because it only includes 3 notes so far. And the alto line is almost entirely conjunct apart from this skip. And it hovers around A. Tenor part hovers around E, and those are 2 of the stable tonic triad notes. And what are the progressions here? Well, we've got tonic to subdominant and back again, with a passing chord in between. Then we've got from tonic to subdominant again, and then back, again with this time passing chords before and after the subdominant. So this corresponds to the rule of the octave, except that at this point we don't continue down, it goes back up. So we can also say that this is a predominant dominant tonic pattern, although not a cadential one, because the bass line goes from the leading note to the tonic. Then we have a change of position, that is to say same chord but different position because it's first inversion. Then we have tonic to tonic with a dividing chord. And then we have predominant dominant tonic and a cadence, which is what we'd call an imperfect authentic cadence with a mediant note in the soprano. So far the harmony corresponds to the patterns we looked at. It's all about going from tonic subdominant back, tonic subdominant back with passing chords in between, embellishing the tonic chord with a dividing chord and a passing note as well, and then predominant dominant tonic. Okay, let's continue. The tenor, unsurprisingly, stays on E, and we need a third at all times, so there it is in the alto. So this is chord 5, passing note. This is still chord 5, but first inversion now. Now here, what you don't want is 2 leading notes at the same time. So the alto skips down to E from G sharp, and the tenor skips down to a B, and then back up. Now the alto skips up to G sharp, otherwise there wouldn't be a leading note. The leading note is exchanged between the alto and the bass. The bass goes E, G sharp, E, and the alto goes G sharp, E, G sharp. Then the leading note resolves up, tenor stays on the note E yet again. So this is chord 1. E and G sharp, that's chord 5. And then we go to chord 6. Tenor throws in a passing 7th. The alto could do a unison on A, but on this occasion, Bach doubles the root of chord 6. Then we've got D and G sharp, which gives us a chord 7 in A major. But I'm just going to make a note that this is a 6th chord. And then we've got C sharp and E sharp. And this chord is not a diatonic chord in A major. We've modulated, and I'll come back to that. Final phrase begins with the same chord. Then we've got another F sharp minor chord. And it turns out we're back in A major here because this is chord 6. Octave F sharp, approached in similar motion, but not parallel, and one part moves up by step. Then we've got an E and a G sharp. Same sonority as here and here, which is chord 5, root position. And then A and C sharp. Maybe you're guessing now that we'll have this one yet again, E and A. So we've got two roots, and again, they're approached in the same direction, but not in parallel. And this part moves up by step, and this is actually a minim. Alto leaps down to an E, which gives us an E major chord with the root doubled as a unison, and this unison is approached in oblique motion because the tenor doesn't move. So it's a chord 5 first inversion, and this is going to be a passing chord down to this one. Then we have the notes D and A, which gives us a D major chord, doubled root, root approached in contrary motion. Notes E and A, which is a 6/4 chord. So I'm going to put passing 6/4, or you could put 1/6/4. And then here, it's almost the same as this cadence, F sharp and an A. The A is the 7th of 2/7 first inversion. The 7th resolves down. But the difference is now that the soprano ends on the tonic degree rather than the mediant. So the alto skips down, as I discussed, and the tenor also moves down, otherwise there'd be no third in the last chord. So again, the progressions are dominant tonic, and then tonic dominant submediant, which is like surprise, but it's not an interrupted cadence because this is not the end of a phrase. And then something happens here, and then we go back into A, and it's 6/5/1, which is predominant dominant tonic, passing chord. And effectively, these are all passing chords on the way down to the supertonic chords, which is another predominant dominant tonic. Like so. C sharp major, what could that mean? The least obscure explanation of this chord is that it's the dominant in F sharp minor. F sharp minor is the relative minor, so that's a closely related key. And we've got F sharp minor chords here and here. So it's a safe bet that we're in F sharp minor. And in the context of F sharp minor, the chord F sharp minor is 1. G sharp diminished is the supertonic chord in first inversion. And C sharp is the dominant. And F sharp minor is the tonic again. So sure enough, what happens here is completely normal, and it's what we already looked at, except in a different key, because it's tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic. But E major is not a chord in F sharp minor, so this is the segment that is in F sharp minor. And these chords are called pivot chords. Pivot chords are chords that allow you to modulate smoothly from one key to another, because they belong in both keys. F sharp minor is chord 6 in A, and it's chord 1 in F sharp minor. G sharp minor is chord 7 in A, and it's chord 2 in F sharp minor. I didn't bother to write down 7 here because the truth is I already knew that this was a modulation. And this chord is a pivot chord on the other end. F sharp minor is the same pivot chord because it's 1 in F sharp minor and 6 in A major. And the idea is that you're in one key all the way along here in A major. You do something normal, such as dominant submediant, and then you reinterpret one or more chords according to a different scale, so that the roots represent different scale degrees and therefore have different functions and different effects. And that's why we use this double-decker system of annotation, because you want to see what the root is in both relevant keys at the same time, not least because you can check that it's normal, whatever the progression is normal in both keys. And the other important thing to remember about pivot chords is that it isn't sufficient for them to be in both keys as a diatonic chord. They have to be connected in both directions in some normal way, such as predominant, dominant, tonic, or passing chords, or sequence, or one of the miscellaneous progressions like dividing chord, etc. Another common type of modulation is for the tonic chord in a major key or a minor key to be reinterpreted as the subdominant in the dominant key. For example, Chorale 9 is in G major. And the chord G gets reinterpreted as 4 in D. Tonic chord, chord 6, momentarily chord 4, and we know we can do this. We know we can go 1, 6, 4 as predominance, then 5, 1, 5, 7 in fact. There's the 7th. The resolution of the 7th is decorated with an extra root, which let's pretend it's an escape note, even though it's a chord note. And then here, we've got an A7 chord, A, C sharp, E, G. So this is 5, 7, third inversion in D, or if you prefer 5, 7, D. And that goes to chord 1. Then it's 5, 5, 7, 1, with a 4-3 suspension. So the harmony works like this: tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic in G. G equals predominant, dominant, tonic, dominant, tonic in D major. But this chord isn't in D really, so the pivot chord is the G major chord. That's because there's no C natural in the scale of D major. But this illustrates how important the predominant dominant tonic formula is, and how useful it is that you've got several equivalent predominant chords to choose from. And remember the progression in which chord 6 is used as a dividing chord. In C major, I've got chord 1, down to chord 6, and then down to chord 1 first inversion. Well, sometimes Bach starts a phrase in the minor, here, and modulates straight away into the relative major using this concept. For example, Chorale 13 is in A minor and goes like this. So it's fairly clear that the tune modulates straight into C, or implies a modulation straight into C, but the chorale starts officially in A minor with chord 1. But in this case, the very first chord is a pivot chord. It's this subdividing progression, except that it doesn't really divide anything exactly in this case, because you don't get the first tonic chord. Nonetheless, it sounds good and sounds normal. Here's a little neighbor note. We've got chord 4. We can call these passing notes. More passing notes. So the next progression is 1, 4, 1, which we know is normal. Then it's 5. And the least complicated explanation of this is that this suspension is decorating what would otherwise be leading note of 5, which is F sharp diminished. And that resolves to a 5, and the 5 is decorated with a 6/4. Then the 6/4 resolves in parallel to 5/3. And then we're back in 1. Sometimes you get quite complex modulations in which you seem to be modulating into one key, but there's a twist. For example, Chorale 144 starts like this. Tonic, and then we go up the rule of the octave. We've got passing leading note chord, tonic chord first inversion, and then here we've got a B7 chord. And normally a B7 chord would be a clue that it's 5 of 5, and we'd expect D sharp to resolve up to E, A, which is the 7th of the 7th chord, to resolve down to G sharp, and this F sharp also to resolve to an E. And it would sound like this. But instead, what Bach does is to modulate from A into F sharp minor, because B7 with a major third is also the subdominant 7th chord. And D can be sharp provided it goes up. So this is in fact E sharp. And E sharp, G sharp, B and a C sharp give you chord 5/7 in first inversion in F sharp minor. So now E sharp is the leading note. It goes up to F sharp, and inner parts go like this. Law of the shortest way doubles the third A. The octave is approached in contrary motion. So this is predominant dominant tonic in F sharp minor, followed by predominant dominant, because he goes back down the scale. This time the notes 6 and 7 are not raised because it's going down the melodic minor scale. So this is chord 4, first inversion, 5, which is called a Phrygian cadence. In the minor key, when you go down a semitone to the dominant, and it's called 4, first inversion, 5, it's called a Phrygian cadence. Tenor does an accented passing note, down to F sharp, then back up. So it sounds like this. Very sneaky. Closely related to modulation are the applied chords, which I mentioned earlier. Normally they're applied dominant chords, also known as secondary dominant chords. For example, I mentioned that if you're in C major, then immediately before chord 5, which is G, you could use what would be the dominant chord in G major, the D major chord, or D7. Or you could use the leading note chord in G major, which is F sharp diminished, possibly F sharp diminished 7. And in fact, you can do this not only before the dominant chord. So secondary dominant doesn't just mean dominant of the dominant. You could do the dominant of the submediant. For example, in C major, before A minor, you could throw in an E7, which would almost be the same as chord 3. Or before chord 4, which is F, you could throw in a C7 or an E diminished 7. And if you're in C major, then chord 2 is a minor chord, so you can throw in the dominant of D minor. And then you have to do D minor. So you can normally do this before any major or minor triad, but not diminished ones, because they don't have a dominant. Let's give you an example. Chorale 224 is in F major, and it starts like this. Chord 1, chord 1 again, with characteristic leaps up, chord 1, first inversion, passing note, chord 5. Here's chord 6, with a 9/8 suspension, and then 5, first inversion, and 1. So incidentally, this is not a cadence because it doesn't go root, root. But that's fine, not every phrase has to end with a cadence. But as you can see, the progression is completely normal. Tonic, dominant, surprise, back to dominant tonic. And in between the dominant and the submediant chords, Bach throws in the dominant of D minor, which is A. So we would write this either with dominant slash 6, meaning dominant of 6, or sometimes just with an arrow pointing to the 6. Now, you can't really say this is a pivot chord because A major is a chord in D minor, but it's not a chord in F. So it's not a pivot chord, and we haven't really modulated because we're just still in F. So what has happened is that Bach has thrown in an applied chord, which sounds good because it resolves to the chord of which it's the dominant. And if you omitted this chord entirely, the progression would still be okay, except that you'd have parallel fifths between the bass and the tenor. And indeed, this is one reason why you might use applied chords. Sometimes they're a way of solving parallel fifths. These chords are normally inserted in the middle of a phrase, but not always. In fact, a few chorales begin with an applied chord. Chorale 94 in Riemenschneider, for example, is in G minor, but it starts like this with a bass B natural, which is a clue that B natural is probably the leading note in relation to C minor. This is quite a disjunct bass line, by the way. I'm not sure you would get away with such a disjunct bass line. So the first chord is a G major chord with two roots, and that's not a diatonic chord, so it has to be understood as the dominant of the subdominant, and it's the dominant first inversion of the subdominant. Then you go back to tonic, dominant, tonic, first inversion, dominant seventh, first inversion, tonic, dominant. A lot of alternating tonics and dominants. Maybe that's why Bach decided to spice it up at the start with an applied chord. One other thing I should mention concerns the connection between the end of one phrase and the beginning of another. Most often, the end chord of one phrase and the beginning of another will correspond to one of these patterns. For example, a phrase will end on the dominant and the next phrase will start in the dominant, or will start on the tonic. Or a phrase will end on the tonic and the next phrase might start on the dominant, or the dominant of the dominant. But not always. Occasionally, Bach will just stop and then resume in another closely related key. So he might end with a half cadence in a minor key and then just start again in the relative major. This is what happens in Chorale 294, for example. It's in B minor, first phrase ends 5-1 in B minor. Second phrase ends 1-5 in B minor. And then the third phrase just leaps to chord 1 in D. But it's advisable if you can get all the phrases to connect up from one phrase to the next in the same way as you would connect up the chords within a phrase.